Welcome to Flyboys. Well, over the last 3 months since the middle of December 2024 until now, which is the middle of March 2025, I put aside my model airplane building and focused instead on starting the build of my HO model train layout. The initial goal was to get a double-track main line built around the perimeter of the layout so that I could run some trains. Here is the result of that 3 months worth of effort. Prior to this effort, my focus had been on building Craftsman structure kits that would be utilized on a future layout. The last one I built prior to this effort was this Route 9 diner. As you'll see in this video, my building of Craftsman structured kits continued even while I was working on the layout itself. In the middle of December, this is what I started with: a blank slate of plywood, 17 feet long, 5 feet wide, with a bump out to 6 feet wide at the near end. I started the layout build process by laying out with blue painter's tape a rough approximation of where the main lines and some of the spur lines would run on the plywood. I also laid out a rough approximation of where I thought some of the future Craftsman structure kits that I want to build for the layout would be located. This has changed as the layout build has evolved. I plan for my layout to be a proto-freelance representation of my hometowns of Troy and Waterford, New York. In order to get everything in the layout that I want, the positioning of the Troy Union Station was critical to the rest of the layout. So I focused initially on building the station platforms for the Union Station so that I could then build off of that. Unfortunately, I have a basement lally column that extends up through my layout, and I wanted to disguise it. So I took a Craftsman structure kit I have of the XO Tower, which is a switching tower located in Mechanicsville, New York. I have relocated that tower to Troy, New York, and built a mock-up of it around the lally column, just so I know where the placement of that would be. Next up, I extended the cork roadbed and the double main line track through the rest of downtown Troy, New York. The track through Troy and South Troy ends by crossing a through girder bridge over the Posenkill Creek that flows into the Hudson River, and then the track continues over to Peebles Island. My Craftsman structure kit builds continued at the same time when I found this picture of the Waterford D&H freight office and realized that I had a kit very similar to it in my inventory. So I built that kit, and this is what we ended up with. On the layout, there is a 3.5-inch elevation change between downtown Troy and a bridge over the Erie Canal in Waterford. So to accommodate that elevation change, coming out of the north end of Troy, there is a curve which starts with a 2% grade change around the curve and then continues through Waterford up to the bridge. Once I installed the risers, I covered them with masking tape so my future application of ballast would not fall down in between the risers. And then I also painted them a dark brown color because I felt it'd be easier to apply this earth color now than later on after all the track was down. My next kit build through this process was this through truss bridge, which will take the double main lines out of South Troy and cross the Posenkill Creek into Peebles Island. I also started construction of the double-track truss bridge that crosses the Erie Canal in Waterford. Here's a photo of the actual bridge that I am modeling. And here is the kit itself. About this time, I received the double-track crossover switch I had been waiting on in order to continue laying track on the Waterford side of the layout. You can see that crossover switch compared to a normal switch here. I continued my work on the curve by laying in paperboard strips, which were intended to add a little bit of a bank to the trains as they rounded the curve. I then added a coat of dark earth brown to everything and laid in the cork roadbed around the curve. And finally, I installed the track from the Troy Union Station around the curve up to the double crossover switch. While this portion of the layout build had been going on, I had also been collaborating with Bill Brown, who runs Lark Products out of Jamesville, New York. Bill produces and publishes railroad graphics and backdrops for model railroad layouts. He and I collaborated on a dual-sided backdrop with downtown and industrial Troy, New York on one side of the backdrop and scenic overview from Waterford across the Hudson River into the hills of North Troy on the other side of the backdrop. This is the proofs that he sent me of what we collaborated and worked up together. Bill then printed out two 13-foot long by 1 foot tall backdrops, one of Troy and one of Waterford, and I was thrilled with the way they came out. Here's some photos of just a portion of each one of those backdrops. I then temporarily propped up each of the backdrops down the full length of the layout, and here's the views of what you will ultimately see on both the Troy side with its backdrop and the Waterford side with its backdrop. Since I was in bridge building mode, I also decided to do a quick build of the truss bridge that goes from Waterford over to Peebles Island. Here's a photo of the real bridge and then of my model of it. I also decided to place one of my earlier kit builds on the layout just for display purposes. Here it is. And once all the bridges were built, I continued my kit construction with this 4-building city block, which will be placed in downtown Waterford once complete. Meanwhile, on the layout, I continued with my installation of risers, cork roadbed, and track across Waterford and up to the bridge going over the Erie Canal. With the bridge completed and weathered, I installed the bridge abutments on either side of the canal and then installed the bridge with the bridge track in it onto the layout. I now proceeded with the final section of mainline track installation from Waterford around the end of the layout over Peebles Island and connecting back into Troy. Because of the shortness of this distance, I had to use a 4% incline as opposed to a 2% incline like I did on the other end. With the bridge over the Posenkill now in its final location, I was able to add in the cork from the bridge back to South Troy. And then I proceeded to work on the banking of this curve, just like at the other end of the track. However, this time I used a different process. I used balsa strips to apply the banking, and I was much happier with the results of that. With the inclines and risers being covered with masking tape and then the balsa banking strips applied, I applied a coat of paint over everything and then added in the cork roadbed. And finally, I installed the tracks, completing the 2 main lines around the entire perimeter of the layout, thus allowing me to now be able to run trains. Here's a brief photo tour around the entire layout as it stands at this point in time. And here is a video walk around of the entire layout as it stands at this point in time. And finally, let's run some trains.